Hey, what's up? This is Twisted Mind, and you're watching the First Look series, an overview of the changes made to your class going into the Mists of Pandaria. First thing you'll notice about Death Knights is our Horn of Winter now does a flat 10% boost to our attack power, up from its previous incarnation. Also, if you're Spect Blood, you'll notice that your diseases apply the Weaken Blows effect. All tanks now have this. If you're Spect Frost or Unholy, you'll notice that you now have the 10% melee and ranged haste buff aura. Also, when you apply diseases to a target, you put the 4% physical vulnerability debuff on them. The Death Knight presences also had an entire overhaul going into Mists. If you're in the Blood presence, you now get a stamina boost, armor boost, and less damage taken. If you're in Frost presence, you get increased runic power generation and reduced crowd control on your character. And if you're in Unholy presence, you get an attack speed bonus, rune regeneration speed bonus, and an increase to your movement speed. Each of the three presences gets a boost depending on what spec you are to further encourage you to match your present to your respective spec. However, switching presences can still be advantageous in PvP. When you switch presences, you lose all of your current runic power. However, there is a glyph now that exists that can retain 70% of that runic power when you switch presences. As I'm demonstrating here, I'm losing runic power when I switch presences. The first thing you'll notice about Blood Death Knights is that our diseases now that were tied to Outbreak don't have 100% uptime because Outbreak is back up to a minute cooldown. The workaround for this is if you apply your Blood Boil, then it refreshes the disease duration. Alternatively, you can also glyph for Outbreak to have no cooldown, but it will cost 40 runic power. Blood Death Knights will also notice that Scent of Blood has been changed. It still generates extra runic power, but it is not triggered by dodging or parrying. It is now triggered a chance on melee hit, which now increases the value of haste for Blood Death Knights. It also stacks up to 5 times. It also increases the healing done by your next death strike for each of these stacks and, subsequently, the power of its blood shield. This change only further accentuates the need to spread out your death strikes, so if you've been mashing them together off cooldown, it's time to learn how to spread them out. The Tier 60 talents for Blood Death Knights are particularly interesting. Specifically, the new talent Death Siphon creates a choice of whether to dump your death runes into more death strikes or maybe into death siphons. I'm stripping down completely naked here to show that my mastery is exactly 50% of a death strike's heal, and I'm also showing that death strike is exactly 7% of a minimum health as long as I didn't take more than that in the preceding 7 seconds. If you're playing Death Knights in Kata, you know that sometimes that preceding 7 seconds can change wildly depending on your avoidance or your tank cooldowns and how much damage you've taken by encounter mechanics. The new Scent of Blood also wildly changes the value of how much our Death Strike will strike us for and put a shield up depending on our damage taken. It remains to be finalized to see which of these abilities does more survivability per rune. But I will say from my internal testing that the death strikes do scale with your health at a base minimum or the damage taken depending on how low your avoidance is, whereas this new ability scales with your strength and attack power from Vengeance. Also note that this new ability can be cast at ranged. Though that isn't the only interesting choice for Blood in the level 60 tier, also Death Pact has been changed around a bit. It's been buffed because your ghoul now lasts 1 minute and has a 2-minute cooldown, so you can get it off more often or you'll have more flexibility in using it. But also, with the new Control Undead spell, you could potentially steal that life from controlled minions, should your Raise Dead be on cooldown. You can also do this from your Army of the Dead. Keep in mind the new Purgatory talent will need burst healing to cheat death. Conversion also looks attractive if you're able to pool all of your runic power and your runes, and it can have a surprisingly high uptime if you can continue to push your runic power further with runic abilities. Another noteworthy talent is in the same tier as Chillbrains. It's called Asphyxiate. Not only does it reduce your Strangulate cooldown down to 1 minute, but it also removes that cost of the 1 blood rune, and it's a stun, and I guarantee you stuns are going to be very helpful in those challenge modes. Frost Death Knights saw a lot of changes because of the presence revamp, but even through all of that, at the end of the day, the rotation is still the exact same priority rotation that it was in Cataclysm. If you wield a two-hander for Frost, then the Might of the Frozen Wastes in your spellbook is what applies when you're wielding it. Also note that you should be in Frost presence. And it significantly increases the damage done by your Obliterate. This means you should almost always try to get your Killing Machine procs to be spent on Obliterates, which even means maybe potentially delaying your rotation a second instead of spending it on a Frost Strike and waiting for Obliterate to come back up. You're also going to want to keep Plague Strike on your bars because Blood Plague needs to now have 100% uptime in order to ensure that your Obliterates are hitting their hardest. This also means now that two-handers are subject to the dreaded dead time in their rotation instead of a fluid every global spent rotation. However, that may change at higher haste levels, and also note that haste is now the kingpin stat after expertise and hit for two-handers. Dual Wield Frost will play a little bit differently thanks to the Threat of Thessarian talents. What this talent's going to do is it's going to change the priority so that Frost Strike is now above Obliterate, which means you're going to want to maximize your runic power generation instead of trying to dump your runes. It also means that you should try to proc all of your killing machines on Frost Strikes instead of Obliterates. Because Frost Strike is so high in the rotation, it means that Mastery is going to be the kingpin stat for Dual Wield Frost. And also that it's going to be the kingpin AoE spec. Unholy also has the exact same rotation that it had in Cataclysm. Because to the boost in our talents to Unholy Presence, you still want to be in Unholy Presence, and this remains the spec that does the most damage through dots because of the Ebon Plaguebringer specialization. There was one small tweak to the rotation, and that's because Festering Strike and Scourge Strike now do a little bit more physical damage. There's no need to cast Death and Decay in a single target rotation. Otherwise, the rotation remains the same, and the stat priority is still Haste as a kingpin. The 1 second global that you might be missing from Unholy is now baseline for all Death Knights, so the pace should still feel frantic and be mashing everything at every global. The basic DPS rotations remain largely untouched, however, the rotations will all change drastically depending on what you take in the level 75 tier of the new talent tree. With Runic Corruption, you really want to break up your runic power spells with your runic spells, and if you're familiar with gaming runes to proc with your runic empowerment as a Blood Death Knight, that should be a familiar rotation to you with the runic empowerment talent. And the new Blood Tap is the talent that gives you more control over when your runes are procced. However, that Blood Tap can be macroed into your runic power dump abilities, and most Death Knights have been testing that that's the best way to use it. Here I'm going to demonstrate Blood Tap because that was the most confusing to understand. As you can see, when I use my runic power dump abilities, it stacks 2 at a time of these blood charges. When I reach 5 blood charges, I can choose to dump them off with Blood Tap and proc one of my fully depleted runes. Note that you have to manage those runes to make sure that they're fully depleted before activating it. And note, since it's a 2 gain charge and a 5 gain dump, it will be an inconsistency, so you won't be able to just have a set rotation with it. You can also save these up and use them for burst in PvP should you choose. Or if you need more control over when to get your death runes up, the runes that are procced from this ability are death runes. Keep in mind that death runes now have a lot more value because abilities like Necrotic Strike now are only usable with death runes. So pooling your death runes together to dump a Necrotic Strike on a focused target is going to be a PvP advantage. However, don't be discouraged and think that this is a PvP nerf. There are numerous glyphs that have been introduced that are phenomenal for PvP, including stuns, better silences, offensive dispels, absorbs through Death Coil, more healing abilities, immunities to crowd control, and numerous slows. The new level 87 ability is an execute that corresponds to the rune that matches your spec. It has a 5-second delay before it does a burst of damage, and it scales with your Shadow Mastery if you're Unholy. If it doesn't go off, it gives you a 50% haste boost, which greatly increases your rune regeneration. If you like this video or others on my site, you can support me by liking, favoriting, commenting, or subscribing to me. I really do appreciate it. Thanks.